Okay. So I want to welcome you all to our Valparaiso University class on religion, spirituality, and global health. I'm Professor Susan Holman, and our audience today includes the students in the regular class, as well as a small group of other VU students or faculty. They're all students today. We've opened this session up to others at VU since we have today an invited guest speaker, Dr. Barbara Rossing. And first I will introduce Dr. Rossing and then I'll turn it over to her. And during the session, I will be monitoring the waiting room to let you in if you accidentally get lost, lose your connection. And you can also use the chat function for questions or to reach out to me if you're desperately needing to tell me something. So I will now introduce our speaker. So the Reverend Dr. Barbara Rossing is Professor of New Testament at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. I met Dr. Rossing many years ago when we were both divinity school students at Harvard, where she earned her doctorate. Our group, our class, was spending 6 weeks trekking through the dust and the wilderness of ancient sites in Greece and Turkey. And so I know from personal experience that you will enjoy her time with us today. Dr. Rossing loves to teach and preach about the Bible, including its role in public life and its connection with the natural environment and global health issues. She's the author of a number of books and commentaries on the book of Revelation and the idea of apocalypse, as well as articles and chapters on apocalypse and ecology. When she's not in Chicago, she's usually living in rural Washington state, where she's been pastor for many years at the Holden Village Retreat Center, known to Valparaiso in various ways. As a public theologian, she's appeared on 60 Minutes, as well as the History Channel and National Geographic. She's also very active with environmental issues at the seminary. I would encourage you to look up her full bio at the seminary site, and maybe even use her visit to think about seminary yourself, if you might ever think about a career connecting global issues with religion. I'll stop here and I'll say it is a real privilege to welcome Dr. Rossing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Holman, and it's wonderful. I forgot that about Greece and Turkey trekking together, but I love going on field trips and hope we can go on one together again. I'm honored to be with you in this class because this is some of the work I'm starting to do more now on the Bible and healing. And it's really exciting to be with you. So just to say, Professor Holman's a great example of how you can combine seminary studies with health and healing things. So we'd love to have you, if you're interested at all in seminary, talk to me. We have a seminary sampler coming up March 9 to 11, if you think you might have a calling or a dual career calling. But I'm really impressed that so many of you are going into global health careers. And I'm very grateful you let me listen in last week to your discussion about ghost maps and the role of story, that story of Snow and Whitehead and the London cholera and the pump handle. Thank you. So today we're shifting to the global ecological crisis and global spirituality and health. And what I'm going to do is bring together a couple themes I'm working on: future visions, which the technical term for that theologically is eschatology, and we'll talk more about that, and healing. And I like to work on Jesus and healing and the Bible and healing, but it's found in all religions, of course. And then this image of the tree of life that is a very interreligious image. It's in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and also in the book of Revelation. And what I love about it's also a scientific notion. Darwin used the tree of life as a way to express our relationships as communities of species and genetic relationships. So I'll talk about that. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on the Jewish image of tikkun olam, which I think is really important, this idea of repairing the world or mending the world. I'm not an expert on that, but I loved that Science Cocoon article by Hotez that was assigned for today. So I'll try to pull some of these together, and then I want to leave time for questions and comments so you can help me pull these threads together as well. So the chapter you read by me was in a book of feminist ecological essays responding to Pope Francis's Laudato Si. And I see that you're going to read that for this next session on Thursday, which is great. I think Pope Francis is one of the most important environmental leaders of our time. And I'll show a few slides in a minute and talk about him as well. But I think he is one who helps bring together the role of religion and science and important themes of stopping disease, including the disease of climate change. I mean, it's not the same as cholera that you looked at last week, but most climate scientists say that as climate gets worse, the crisis exacerbates, then all of these diseases, these tropical diseases and more, are going to become more of a threat. So how can religion be a healing force? How can it maybe even be a preventative measure? How can it be a tool working with science? Now, and Blevin's lecture a couple of weeks ago, I thought was really good on the social gospel and how some of the roots of hospitals even are in Christianity and religion. I want to start by saying religion can be really bad as well. And the more, I mean, you probably all know this, the more you talk to people who've grown up in really extreme fundamentalist families and how religious abuse was part of their life. I'd say looking at the events of January 6th and the riots that came into the US Capitol and seeing that people had Jesus saves banners and they were also attacking people. It's unbelievable. So religion can be a terrible force for ill and extremism and violence, but I believe it also can be a force for good. And that's what I want to work on with you here. I'm really hoping you'll let me listen in on Thursday, maybe, because I knew Steve DeGrucci. You're going to be reading one of his articles on cholera. I knew him at Holden Village, and his sister now, Janelle, is a doctor working on public health issues in London. So it's wonderful that you're reading his work as well. Last week's discussion on the London sewage and water and cholera reminded me how thankful we need to be for sewers as part of public health, and that there are people in the US who still live without sewers. One of the most recent MacArthur Genius Grant recipients, Catherine Flowers of Louisiana, wonderful African-American leader, talked about the number of people in areas, especially in the South, who don't have septic or sewers and are being really hurt by that. So it's a good reminder, this is still going on. Okay, I'll just start with the big question that a number of you had about my article, which is, what is eschatology? And when I was writing this, it's in, maybe I'll start screen sharing now, so I can show you the book that this is in. I'm not the greatest at screen sharing, but I'm really going to attempt this here. Okay, why can't I find this? Here it is. Okay, share screen. So I just titled this talk today, For the Healing of the World, because that's the theme I love to work on: global health, tree of life, and eschatology today. And this is where I teach the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and hope some of you might come. Okay, now I gotta remember how to do PowerPoint here. Sorry. Okay, so this slide shows, and I don't know why the PowerPoint is so stretched out, but anyway, on the right is this book that essay was in, called Planetary Solidarity, Global Women's Voices and Christian Doctrine and Climate Justice. So it was women theologians from all around the world. On the left-hand side is my book that got me on 60 Minutes and all these TV stations, called The Rapture Exposed. And I'll talk some about the issues from that as well, that I think some problematic eschatologies or visions of the future are this idea that Jesus wants to rapture us out of our cars and take us up to heaven off the earth. I called it heavenism in the chapter, but I think we really have to counter that with the idea that God's vision for renewal is to renew this world, not to take us off of planet Earth and destroy this earth. So I really think this is problematic, and we can talk about it. let's see the next slide. What is my problem here? Okay. Oh, these are some of the women then who authored chapters in that book. I'm in the second here from in the front row, but you can see it's really global women leaders. Professor Holman will recognize Elizabeth Schisler Fiorenza, who was one of the respondents. And this is Karenna Gore, who runs a Center for Earth Ethics at Union Seminary in New York. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my own story now, my vocational journey of seeing God's healing in creation, which maybe will help you get inspired for your own vocational journey, how you're going to bring together God's healing and your own work. In some ways, it started for me professionally as this theme for the Lutheran World Federation in 2003 for the healing of the world. And I was invited to write Bible studies on this. So already there, I'm going to get back to the question of eschatology in a minute, but just to say this is my own sort of journey. I had loved studying science all through school. When I first discovered, my mom taught, or school taught me about photosynthesis and that all the oxygen we have is breathed out by trees. It was just dazzling to me, unbelievable. And then as Professor Holman said, I was pastor and many years a volunteer at Holden Village, starting already at late high school. So really finding community with other people there was very powerful. At the same time, I was a geology major in college and I loved field trips. So that's why it was so great that Professor Holman and I went to Greece and Turkey together. But discovering fossils of trees, discovering fossils of everything is just amazing to realize how old the earth is and how incredibly complicated it is as a living system. And then I'm calling this Glimpsing God's Tree of Life. So I guess one question for you all today is, where have you seen the tree of life in your life? And how is your life a tree of life? Because I think we do get these glimpses of the tree of life that reminds us of this community of relationships. And for me, it was, it's been multiple times, but I remember this one time on a hike, seeing this incredible tree way up in the high alpine mountains of the Cascade Mountains where I live now. And then also other elements that I bring into this are liberation theology. This is Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff tells us we have to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and that our job is to bring these cries together, listening to all these voices. And I think there really are cries today for healing, heard in global voices from the margins, in the climate crisis, COVID-19, all the disasters and sicknesses that you're going to be working on in your lives. I can never remember what my next slide is. Okay, so these are, again, I don't know why my slides are so stretched out, but these are some of the books that I bring together then in healing. The one on the left for the healing of the world, this was the Lutheran World Federation theme book in 2003 that started me writing on this, even though I'd already written my dissertation to do Bible studies for the healing of the world and think about issues of healing. And one of the persons on the team with me writing these Bible studies was a woman from Brazil who had had polio as a child. And she really helped our team recognize the important difference between healing and cure. And I don't know if you'll work on that with medical anthropologists talk about it, Kleinman and others, that she said, I will never be cured of polio. I will always have to walk with these crutches and be in a wheelchair. But she said, I have found healing. And that is through community, she said. It didn't mean miraculously walking again, but healing meant full inclusion in community. It meant accessibility. It meant being able to pursue her professional goals, which was to be ordained as a pastor, and being a member of the body of Christ with gifts to share. So I think for all of how we talk about healing, it's important to remember it's not a magical cure, but it is overcoming barriers to community. It's overcoming discrimination and stigma and finding abundant life, whatever that looks like. The second book is the one I'll talk a little bit about with Tikkun Olam. This is by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of London. And he uses this image of healing for the world as well. And then, I mean, healing as a metaphor, you can use it for all kinds of things. with recent events in Washington, D.C., I thought back to this book by Parker Palmer, Healing the Heart of Democracy, that our politics need healing, everything needs healing. And I think this image of healing, both, I mean, obviously we need literal healing now in the midst of the COVID pandemic, but metaphorically as well, so many things need healing. And that can be a very biblical and religious image, that, as well as a scientific one, that you all will bring. Oh, I think I put in a childhood picture here to show you how much I used to love nature. This is my family. I guess my dad's taking the picture, but the 5 of us kids visiting Crater Lake with my mother. And I, all my life, have loved to go to national parks, to any kind of natural area. I love the mountains. So this is, I guess, in my life, what I've worked on is bringing together this love of nature and ecology and finding God in nature, in the wilderness, with this biblical urgency now for eschatology, for hope, and in the midst of the climate crisis. Oh, I guess I threw in this picture too. Sorry, this was on my bucket list. This was my husband and I when we got to visit probably the most important fossil bed in the world, the Burgess Shale up in Canada. And this is where Stephen Jay Gould wrote his book, Wonderful Life, about the incredible thriving of life that has happened through evolution. And this amazing fossil called Pikaia, that's the first one that has a symmetrical backbone with 2 things on either side. So to find these fossils, it was really, really fun to hike way up high. Okay, here's another picture of my husband and me with solar panels on our house now where we live here. Okay, but now to the Bible here. This image, this is an icon from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai in Egypt, of Moses taking off his shoe when God talks to him from the burning bush. This idea of holy ground is one I want to encourage you to carry with you, that all the places where we live, all the ground we trod on, everywhere we are is holy ground, and God calls us to take off our shoes. It's really an amazing thing about the world, that God calls us to turn aside and see holiness everywhere. This is where I teach at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, and very much grounded in science. We have a Zygon Center for Religion and Science, where we have, right now I'm lecturing in another class called The Epic of Creation, where we talk about how the world is definitely 4.5 billion years old. The universe is 13 billion years old. We look at how the atmosphere evolved and all kinds of things like that. And then we bring that into conversation with biblical and theological themes. So science is huge in what I think we need to be about right now. This is one of my favorite climate scientists, Katharine Hayhoe, who teaches at Texas Tech University. She's an evangelical Christian. She and her husband wrote a book together, and they really talk about the urgency of the climate crisis. This is Pope Francis. So his book, Laudato Si, that you're going to read for next week. I don't know if you're reading a download. I like paper copies better, so this is the one from Paulus Press. But any publisher can publish it. But his Laudato Si on care for our common home is taking the poetry of St. Francis and then saying, now we all urgently need to care for our common home. So he says, human-induced climate change is a scientific reality, and its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. So he doesn't frame it so much in terms of sickness and healing, although that's definitely in there. But I think you then, as public health professionals, medical, whatever you're doing, you can use his work to frame the climate crisis as this urgent health crisis that God wants to heal our world from. This is one of my favorite slides of Pope Francis. So he himself is a chemist by training, a scientist. And this was maybe 3 years ago when the astronauts on the space station included an Italian. And so the newspaper article said, Pope Francis phones up the heavens. And he decided to talk to the astronauts on the space station and ask them all kinds of questions about what they saw out there, what it was like. And then he asked them this question about, what do you think about love is the force that moves the universe? And this was based on a tapestry behind Pope Francis. You can't see it, but he's sitting in front of a tapestry based on Dante's Paradise, that has this idea that love is the force that moves the universe. So anyway, he's very interested in science. And oh, here's the quote: "Hello to the heavens, Pope Francis phones the space station, and he asks the astronauts, what do you think about referring to love as the force that moves the universe?" Now, obviously, you can't see it as an astronaut, but hopefully all of us believe that there is a force in the universe that is love, that is this power for transformation and grace that guides our work. Um, oh, Genesis 1. Okay, I threw a few slides in here. So the creation story at the beginning of the Bible, for Jews and Christians, is this beautiful story in Genesis 1 with this refrain, ki tov, which means how good or how beautiful. God said each time, it's almost as if God is surprised by how beautiful each day is and says, wow, how good, ki tov. So it's typically translated as God saw that it was good, and that's okay. That's fine. You can translate key as that, but I think it's more wonderful to translate as how good, or even God saw how beautiful it is. And that's how God continues to see our world and wants us to see it that way as well. We can't give up on our world, but we have to be continually amazed at how beautiful it is, and then how precious that beauty is. So, as you know, the crisis facing us is, even though Earth is huge and robust, and it's this, giant rock, very sturdy, it's got this thin blue line around it, and that's the biosphere, the atmosphere, and that's what's so fragile. So I think in looking at the Genesis creation story, you can translate firmament possibly as atmosphere. And then in one of the Genesis verses, God made the firmament, separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters above the dome. God called the dome sky, or atmosphere, you can say, and the dry land earth, and the waters sea. And God saw how good it was, or God saw that it was good. God saw how beautiful it was. And that's our calling right now. I mean, I don't know why we're living right now in this moment of history when we have so few years to really turn things around as far as carbon emissions, but it's really, really important to do that for the healing of the world. And I think God is looking at our world and saying that too, how beautiful it is, how fragile and wonderful it is. Also in Genesis, you've got the earth and the waters themselves as creators, as creative forces. So God's not the only creator. Earth and waters are co-creators with God. The earth brings forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds of every kind and trees of every kind. I think this is a really amazing kind of scientific appreciation of species and speciation. Obviously, the writers of Genesis were poets. They weren't scientists, and the science is very different from what we have today. But again, to enlist the waters and the plants in co-creating, I think is wonderful. And God saw how good it was. So here again is that picture of the thin blue line that astronauts, I mean, it's very striking to me that the astronauts, when they went to look at the moon, say, as I was growing up, what they come back with is to tell you how beautiful Earth is from space, and how they fall in love with Earth just by being so far away. And the Earth is truly their home, and this beautiful, fragile, precious home. So the first American woman astronaut was Sally Ride. We're going to have more, of course, more women. But she wrote this children's book called Mission Planet Earth, Our World, and the climate and how humans are changing them, and sort of an urgent message on climate change. But this is a quote I love from Sally Ride. "When I was an astronaut, I spent hours gazing down at the earth below. I could see rivers emptying into blue oceans. I could see city lights twinkle at night. More than anything, though, I could see how fragile Earth is. I could see a thin, fuzzy blue line outlining the planet. At first, I didn't know what I was seeing. Then I realized it was Earth's atmosphere. It looked so thin. And I realized this air is our planet's space suit. It's all that separates every bird, fish, and person on Earth from space." This is really precious. And that's what we need to take care of. So another religious leader is not Pope Francis. This is Patriarch Bartholomew, the Greek Orthodox Church patriarch. You read that article by Christina Geschwander about Orthodox ecological theology. The Orthodox have really been leaders in this. And Patriarch Bartholomew leads the way in defining our time as an urgent kairos moment. And that's very much a biblical word. There are two words in Greek for time. There's chronos, which kind of means linear time, tick, 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 tick. And then there's kairos time, which is like an urgent moment in time. And he says that's what we are at right now. Kairos is used in the New Testament a lot. I'm happy to talk about with you, but in Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, he says to the Romans, you know what kairos it is. And Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present kairos? So it's this idea of this present moment as being really, really important in time. And it happens that that's when you're in college and you are the leaders who are going to lead us through this urgent moment. And all of us are called upon. I'll talk about the book of Revelation a little more, but just to say the book of Revelation is not about destroying the earth at all. In fact, it says the kairos has come to destroy the destroyers of the earth. And at the time when Revelation was written, that was the Roman Empire. Those people were destroying the earth. And in our time today, who is it? But the message of the book of Revelation and of the whole Bible isn't that the world is going to be destroyed or end, but rather that the world is about to turn. And there's a hymn in our hymn book that I just love. Maybe many of you do, all our students do, but it's called the Canticle of the Turning. And it's based on the song of Mary in the Gospel of Luke. But she says, my heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Do you know this one? Then it goes, wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near and the world is about to turn. And that's a hopeful thing. The world is about to turn. So that's what we need to look at, I think, as religious leaders that some of you are, you'll be healing leaders, is how can we help people see that hopeful message that the world is about to turn? Let's see, I can't remember how many, maybe I'll stop. Oh no, I'm going to do some slides on Roman eschatology. Okay. So here I threw this one in from Martin Luther. This actually was from a project that we had a few years ago for the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, just the 500th anniversary of when Luther put up his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg church door. And this is from a project called the Radicalizing Reformation Project. So this idea that I don't always nail things on church doors, but when I do, it starts a movement. And obviously he was not a Lutheran. Martin Luther was certainly not a Lutheran. So I think it applies to all religious denominations, is what can we be about as spiritual people to help embody the transformation that starts a movement that heals our world. I'm part of Lutherans Restoring Creation. I also get email from Presbyterians for Earth Care in the Catholic Church. I know some of you are Catholics. There's many movements like this, but I really encourage you to join grassroots movements working for healing the climate crisis. Okay, so what you saw in that chapter that you read about is sort of rereading biblical stories, including stories of eschatology, for a more ecological perspective. So this Jonah is not in that chapter, but this second one is this idea in the Lord's Prayer when Jesus teaches people to pray, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. It doesn't mean the purpose of life is to go to heaven. We're not trying to escape off the earth, but rather earth and heaven both would be God's renewal. And heaven is the kingdom of God. It's the vision of healing for the earth. But we shouldn't fall into what actually it turns out is a kind of Neoplatonic idea that the purpose of life is to go to heaven, not the earth. I think our true home as God's people is the earth. That's what God creates, and that's where we are put. So how then do we reread biblical stories to get away from this idea of trying to get off the earth up into heaven? Not that there isn't a relationship with God that lasts forever, but that's what heaven is, rather than a place apart from earth. And I'm happy to talk more with you about that if you want to talk about that. Okay, let's see, what did I put in here? Okay, so back to eschatology. This is, and Professor Holman did share with me some of the queries that people had about the chapter. I would say that eschatology is really important for our spiritual life and our political life, because it's what gives people a sense of hope for the future. It's how you direct yourself for the future. And in the ancient world, when Jesus and the Bible people lived, one empire after another, but in Jesus' time, it was the Roman Empire, it claimed that it was going to last forever. So Rome had an eschatology, a vision of the future, and the eschatology Rome promoted in its propaganda, which we'll see in billboards, in advertisements, in monuments, was Roma Eterna, that is Rome eternal. And that meant this system of Roman conquest, where Rome had to go out and conquer more and more peoples and enslave them. So it included slavery. Maybe 30% of the people were slaves. And the Bible says no to that. So I, in that article, use a couple of verses. The word eschatos means normally last, but it can also mean the edge. So it's normally thought about as the doctrine of last things, but I would say it's better to think about it as future, and that we have competing future visions, not only in the ancient world, but also in our time today. So I use the work of this guy, Brian McLaren, who says, and because I really thought about, should I use the word eschatology? It's so technical, but this is a popular book he wrote, and he says eschatology always wins. So we have to teach using that word, but you can define it then. It's your beliefs about the goal, about the end to which things are moving. And he says these beliefs profoundly and practically shape our present behavior. He says this is especially true about war and violence. And this is why we must be so critical of some versions of American eschatologies. But I think that the notion is really important that every culture has eschatologies. It might be growth without end. That's what I argue in the chapter, that we've been fed this line that we can just grow and grow forever and ever. And that's a false eschatology. What are other false eschatologies? Well, maybe this idea that we can just get back to normal after the pandemic, as if normal was a just system somehow that we want to just resume. Sometimes you can see our eschatologies by looking at advertisements. I don't know if any of you are in advertising as your field of study, but you know how to write ad copy to really appeal to people. No limits, it'd be an eschatology. Prosperity for forever and ever. I don't know, it's this idea, if this system continue, world without end, that's a kind of false eschatology that I think we have to say is making the world sick. And that's again where I say frame this as a sickness, and what we need is healing. And then you can deploy all your best knowledge about public health and everything to help critique what's going on. I mean, the false eschatologies, the false claims, I think are really, really important to counter, but then with a different vision of hope, a vision of hope that acknowledges that in many ways our world is sick and we need healing. Whether it's globally, I mean, when temperatures in India last year went up to 120 and people are dying of heat, or obviously what we're seeing in Texas this week, extreme weather, children dying. But in the Midwest, a couple summers ago, it was so hot that we saw farmers dying of heat stroke. I mean, these extreme weather events, or in Chicago, we see asthma deaths. This is the climate crisis that we are experiencing in all kinds of illnesses. And then that Science Cocoon article talked about the tropical diseases that are going to increase, typhoid, cholera, others. Zika is coming further and further north. When I was growing up, we didn't have Zika in North America, but now we do. So all of this, these are signs of the illness that we need to diagnose and then address with healing solutions. I'd say what the Bible helps us see is that a lot of this is the sickness of empire. And in Jesus' time, it was the Roman Empire. Oh yeah, here, I'm going to talk about these Roman Empire images. Prior to that, it was the Babylon Empire and the Persian Empire. I mean, the empires that run over people and that the Bible speaks against. I think we can use a lot of these prophetic passages now to speak to our time today about how God wants to bring liberation and healing to people. Okay, so the Roman Empire, we don't have any billboards left over, it was 2,000 years ago. But what I want to show you a few slides of now is the kind of propaganda that was everywhere in the time of Jesus and the early Christians. And I think the Bible can be really important as a liberating voice that shows how people critiqued these unjust claims of the Roman Empire. So this is called the Gemma Augustea. It's a cameo, actually kind of a miniature, not very big, in the museum in Vienna, but scholars think that it's a copy of an image that was widely known, that was used in many cities as kind of billboard. And what you see here, I think you can see my cursor, right? This is the Roman Emperor Augustus, and he's sharing a throne with Roma. She's the goddess of Rome. So this is a kind of a bench-like throne. And over here, you see stepping out of his chariot, the next emperor, Tiberius, and the chariot is being driven by Nike. Nike is the Greek and Roman goddess of military victory. So even though we think of Nike as a sports figure, sports goddess, we have Nike tennis shoes and stuff. First and foremost, she was military victory. And you can always recognize her because she's this winged goddess. And the Romans believed she was the one that gave them all their victories. So what you see here is a kind of succession plan. This is the next in the succession. When Augustus dies, it's going to be Tiberius will be the next. And over here, this is Roman propaganda, remember, you see in the Romans' mind, Earth adores this system. So this feminine figure with her cornucopia, you always recognize her that way, that's Earth, or Gay. And then behind her is the ocean, and behind them is oikumene, or the whole inhabited world. So in Rome's mind, the whole inhabited world loves the Roman imperial system. And how it works, they did not hide it. They said how it works is this endless conquest. So it's a kind of an upstairs, downstairs cameo, where you see then that what props up the whole system is ever increasing conquests of more and more foreign nations on the margins of the Roman Empire. So we're not sure exactly which conquest this is during Augustus's time, but you see the soldiers are tying people up. These represent captive nations. They're torturing people, and they're putting up a trophy of victory of Nike on the backs, basically, of these conquered nations. And Rome is saying this is how the world works: conquest without end, victory without end, more and more people under the Roman system of domination, and this is how it will be forever and ever, world without end. But in my view, the Bible says no to that. And you see that anti-imperial perspective all over the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation and in some of the Old Testament prophets, but it really is in all the books of the Bible. Here's another Roman monument. This is in the city of Rome. I think some of you have been there. This is the Column of Trajan. I'm just showing you a few images here, but this is an incredible, here's the big picture of it. It's this column, huge, in the city of Rome. It survived all the way from Roman times till now, partly because it's so big, but also they replaced Trajan, Emperor Trajan statue with St. Peter. I think this is up there now. So now it's a Christian monument. But what you see, it's this incredible eschatology in these panels of war, one scene of war after another. And this was the war against Romania, or Dacia, that Trajan had to fight 2 or 3 times, but won. And it's this spiraling, I can't show you, it's the spiraling panel of 163 war scenes all the way up the column. I mean, it's just the perfect image for endless war, which was what legitimized Emperor Trajan's whole system. And here's one of the details. I mean, you just see all these panels with deaths of the Dacian people, the deaths of the Dacian soldiers. On some of the panels, trees are taken in conquest and chopped down. So it's a conquest not only of people, but also of nature. It begins with a scene of the conquest of the Danube River. So it's truly an image of Roman conquest over everything. And then this is just one other scene. This is actually from Turkey. So Professor Holman and I don't think this wasn't open. This is from Aphrodisias. At least when I went with you, this museum had not yet been open, but this is the Sebastian at Aphrodisias, where all these panels show conquered nations. But here what you've got is Emperor Augustus again, and Nike. You always recognize her by her wings. And this is the Roman eagle. And then they're setting up a trophy of conquest on the head of a captive nation. So you see these scenes of incredible overt conquest, and Rome was basically telling people with these billboards, with these monuments, this is how the world works. This is what life is about, and it's world without end. And the Bible says no to that. So this is sort of my perspective on how we need to view biblical eschatology. Is it's a dueling eschatology. It's over against the Romans eschatology that proclaimed that the world works through conquest and domination. So I showed you Trajan's column, Nike, the Gemma Augustea. And I think what we see in the New Testament is that authors are saying no to the Roman imperial system. The kingdom of God is presented as the opposite, the counter narrative to the kingdom of Rome. So you've got dueling eschatologies, dueling visions of what our future is going to be and of how the world works. And I would unabashedly say that the vision of Jesus that all the New Testament authors write about is a vision of healing, not conquest for our world, and that this is really important for us to lift up today. What have I got in the next slide here? Okay, so I'm just going to say a few things about the book of Revelation and how I think it can help us in the climate crisis, which always is surprising to people. But what you have in Revelation is a sort of choice at the end between two possible political economies, two cities. One is called New Jerusalem, and the other is called Babylon. So apocalypse, I know we think of apocalypse in movies and disasters and stuff, but truly apocalypse means unveiling, pulling back a curtain to reveal something to help us see. And I think that's what biblical apocalypses want to do today, is help us see the urgency of the present moment. So it's not predicting something about the future. It's not prophecy in the sense of prediction. That's really a misreading of prophecy, I think, but it's rather a warning or wake-up call, and help us diagnose the pathology of the system we're in, because you can look at the Babylon vision, and this was the Roman Empire in John's time, but what is it today? Well, it's all the dangers, I would say. I put in environmental injustice here. I'm not sure that's in the Bible, but all the dangers of economic injustice, which obviously was the case in the Roman Empire time, military conquest, idolatry, and calls it a pathology. John really does use those kind of medical terms, and then calls people to come out of that. That's a key verse, Revelation 18, verse 4, in order to be citizens of God's New Jerusalem. And that's what is so wonderful about the book of Revelation, is this vision of the reign of God coming down to earth with a river of life for everyone and a tree of life for healing the nations. And that vision, I think, well, I would invite you to make it central to your own theology and your own work. Oh, I guess I put some more ecology slides in here right now. Okay, so these are actually from one of our premier climatologists, James Hansen, who it was at the NASA Goddard Space Center in New York, and now works full-time on climate. He points out that Earth and Venus both have the same amount of carbon. But the blessing of Earth is that most of our carbon is safely sequestered under the Earth, whereas Venus, it's in its atmosphere, and the temperature difference that it makes is huge. I mean, Venus is way too hot to have water, so you can never have life. But Earth is this sort of perfect Goldilocks temperature, about 15 or 59 degrees Fahrenheit as the average temperature, and it's this beautiful blue planet. So this is just to show why we have to safely keep the carbon sequestered under the Earth in rock layers, where it is right now, in sedimentary rock layers, rather than burning it up and putting it into the atmosphere, because the danger is a kind of runaway Venus effect, which, I don't think we're not going to see that. But the more you thicken the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, the more you heat up a planet. Oh, and I threw in Greta Thunberg too. She's now not 15. This is an old slide, sorry, but she's still this incredible example of a young person who can be a climate leader and inspire all of us by the power of our testimony. Here's that verse from Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2. So what you see at the end of the book of Revelation is a kind of vision of the renewal of the world and the healing of the world, where heaven descends to earth. That is what's so wonderful here. Is I think a truly earth-focused vision. The angel who's taking the author on a tour here showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal. And you could also read that as living water. So any kind of flowing water that you have, whether it's from the pump handle or wherever, flowing water is right here in Revelation, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing fruit each month. So this is addressing world hunger. I mean, it's a vision of the future. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. drew on this vision when he talked about healing poverty and food for everyone. But here's the healing verse: and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So that, I think, is what we need to talk about, is how can we reframe people's understanding of the Bible so it's not for destruction, not for war or violence, but it's for the healing of the nations, the healing of the world. And I really do think this is the central image of the book of Revelation, this tree of life in New Jerusalem for the healing of the world, and the throne of God and the Lamb, from which the river of life flows out. Okay, I can't remember. Okay, so this is my exhortation to all of you. It's a Kairos moment. You happen to be born right at this crucial moment when Patriarch Bartholomew says we really are living at a Kairos time. The world needs our witness for healing. So how can the book of Revelation, or whatever text in your own religious tradition, help give your testimony about the urgency of climate injustice? How can the book of Revelation help us go on an Exodus journey out of the sick system? And that is how I see the plot line of the book of Revelation. It's like a new Exodus. The Exodus in the Old Testament was the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and Pharaoh was the evil one who didn't want to free them, but the plagues convinced Pharaoh that he had to let them go. And so Revelation is doing the same thing in the time of the Roman Empire, telling people to go on an Exodus journey out of the toxic aspects of the Roman system into an alternative way of life that is envisioned as New Jerusalem. And how can we give our testimony to this world healing vision, God's tree of life? Now I've got a few slides to caution about Revelation. It certainly can't be read literally. The whole thing is full of images and symbols. In fact, usually when I lecture, I'm going to hold this up for you. This is I wear this around my neck. This is the emblem of the Moravian Church. I don't know if you can see it. This lamb. Moravians gave it to me. Our Lamb has conquered, let us follow him. The central image of Jesus in the book of Revelation is as a lamb. So obviously that's not literal. Jesus was not literally a sheep. He was a human. So Revelation is imaging people through these metaphors, like Jesus as a lamb, like the Roman Empire as a Babylon, even the whore of Babylon, terrible things. But so there's nothing literal that we can see, and Revelation isn't predicting anything about any current issues, but we can propose analogies. And that's what I think the book can help us do, is read our times in light of the biblical prophetic message. So yeah, this was the cover of the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago. They always do the April issue that's around Earth Day as a kind of Earth focused theme, but I thought this one was really haunting. This idea that, are we really going to put a price on everything and burn up the planet and all these price tags? Now here, just to say, as I said, the goofy interpretations of Revelation are all over the place. You will hear these. Don't believe any of them. Martin Luther should not have portrayed the whore of Babylon as the Catholic Church. And Catholics should not have responded by picturing Martin Luther as the seven-headed beast. But this is what you see over and over, is people telling you what the 666 means, or what Armageddon means, or who the four horsemen are. You can't do kind of one-to-one correspondences. That's not how you read metaphors. And hopefully you know that from your English classes as well. This isn't a secret code that you have to decode. Oh, I've got some slides here of some of these problematic images. When I was growing up, the big problem book for me, I wish I'd known what I know now, is this Late Great Planet Earth. The fundamentalists tried to scare me that I was going to be left behind if I didn't believe exactly what they understood the Bible saying. And now, 10 years ago, it was the Left Behind novels that are equally terrible, probably even worse because they make the whole thing into a storyline. So that's why I wrote the book, The Rapture Exposed, is to critique this. And then this same kind of stuff from this guy in San Antonio, John Hagee. He's terrible, but you'll see him on TV. He has this idea there's a countdown to the end times and the countdown has begun. Don't believe any of this, please. And I'm happy to talk about this if you want. This is really terrible theology. It's not biblical, even though it sounds biblical. And I'm happy to dismantle it piece by piece for you if you want. That's what the book does, but we can talk about it. Same thing with, you'll probably get these kinds of things in your mailbox, hopefully not on campus, but these prophecy seminar brochures come all the time where I live and anywhere you live, trying to say how events at the Capitol, obviously this seminar disagrees about what is the problem with events at the Capitol, but then trying to make world leaders into various figures in the book of Revelation, Trump, Angela Merkel, Pope Francis. This is ridiculous. So all of these are very problematic. And then a friend of mine in Iowa sent me this from the Des Moines Herald, an ad a few years ago. Actually, it was just 3 years ago, saying that, again, that the Catholic Church is the mark of the beast. This stuff comes up over and over, and we just have to say that is not what Revelation says. And here's a page from a Bible study I wrote. This rather is what Revelation says. The heart of the message of Revelation is not that God plans to destroy our world, but that God's desire is to heal. Healing comes to us as a gift of God out of creation through the waters of a river and the leaves of a tree. The image of a life-giving tree of life is common to Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and many other religious traditions. So I think the questions we need to ask are, how can we glimpse this renewal of our earth? How can we glimpse this healing? How can we live as citizens of God's New Jerusalem right now, even if we live in the heart of empire and there's certainly a great deal of injustice around, but that we live, well, I love an African-American scholar in Revelation talks about that we live in a sort of pocket eschatology. You can be a little community of the future, like a little pocket of the future ahead of time. And that, I think, is the biblical vision for all of our communities today. You at Valparaiso, all of us, to be a pocket of hope and healing for the world, even though the vision of God hasn't yet been realized. So how then can the tree of life for the healing of the nations help us? Let's see, here's one of my absolute favorites. I was trying to find this book. It's not on your syllabus, but if you got time to read another book, I love this one. Wangari Maathai was a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya, and she started this wonderful movement called the Green Belt Movement, planting trees all over, millions and millions of trees. But this is her book really about healing, replenishing the earth, spiritual values for healing ourselves and our world. She's a Roman Catholic. She uses biblical stories and also science. I mean, she's a scientist. I think the way she talks about the biblical stories of the Israelites craving for meat when they were in the wilderness is really interesting. She says we all have cravings for more, to consume more and more, but we have to resist these cravings. And she really is good, I think, at using ecology and prophetic spiritual images together. So check out this book. All right, I'm just going to show a few more slides. My gosh, I didn't realize how late it's getting. Of the Tree of Life. This is then the Lutheran World Federation. I worked on this in 2017. But let me just say what's so great. The Tree of Life is in the Bible, as I said, in Genesis and Revelation and other texts. And it's used in a lot of religious traditions, and it's used scientifically. That's what's so wonderful about it. So this is Charles Darwin's drawing. When he developed, his evolutionary theory, he used the image of a tree to map how we are all related to all other creatures. Now, he put humans at the top of the tree, but you probably in your biology classes have seen that we have moved to radically different images of the tree of life as we map more and more genetic sequences. But I still think this idea of a tree as a community of relationships to help us see that we're not just rugged individuals living in isolation, but that we're related to everyone and everything is a wonderful scientific notion as well as a religious one. I think this is the most recent image of the tree of life. It came out a couple of years ago, but they keep changing it as they discover more and more genes and more wonderful life. I mean, that book by Stephen Jay Gould, Wonderful Life, about the explosion of life in the Cambrian era, I think is just as true today, that there's incredible diversity of life. Humans now are not at the top of the tree. We're down here with the other eukaryotes. We are eukaryotes. And most of the creatures in the world, it turns out, are bacteria and even archaea. So it's great to realize how abundant, incredible life is. Oops, I guess I went back in time. This was like the second most recent vision of the tree, I think, when we realized that there is this whole group, archaea, that nobody ever knew about. And we knew there were eukaryotes and bacteria when I was in college, but I don't think we knew about archaea. So more and more new discoveries. And then this is another one that came along a few years ago. This is the idea of doing the tree of life as a circle, mapping genetic relationships across the circle. So this is kind of beautiful as well. And indeed, there's I guess I don't have her slide next, a medieval theologian, here it is, Hildegard of Bingen, whose vision of the tree of life was a circular tree of life. So here she is down in the corner. She was an incredible head of a monastery, an abbess. She was a scientist and doctor, a healer, and also an artist and visionary. So she would draw her visions, and here she's got this tree of life as a circle, which I think is so wonderfully similar to this genetic mapping of genetic relationships as a circle. The tree of life, I go looking everywhere for it. This is in the Church of San Clemente in Rome, this wonderful mosaic. I think it's 13th or 14th century. But anyway, the tree of life here is the cross of Jesus. And you see at the bottom the river coming out and the deer are drinking from it. What's so wonderful, though, is that out from the cross are all these viney tendrils. The branches are these viney spirals. And in the scenes up in the vines, you can't see very well, but this is a woman feeding chickens. Let's see, there's somebody fishing too. But what you see is that in the 13th or 14th century, people were taught to image their life as being participants in God's tree of life. So that, I guess, is an invitation I want to have to you, is where do you see yourself in the tree of life? Where are you up in the viney, interrelated branches of this incredible tree that these medieval people imaged as the cross that turns into this life-giving tree, and a river comes out and deer drink from it? I mean, because what we want to do is help people imagine a future in which we're all together, we're all related, and we all can be part of this healing tree of life. So that, to me, is what these images do. And then this is a Greek Orthodox icon from the Gospel of John, chapter 15. And I actually have my copy behind me here that I bought at a monastery in Palestine. But it's this beautiful image. Hey, Ampelos is what it says in Greek at the top. The vine, God is the gardener, the Georgos, and then all that Jesus is the vine, and we're all branches in it. Now, granted, these are all the male disciples, not surprisingly, from 2,000 years ago. But I think the invitation to all of us is to see ourselves, like maybe this can be me, Barbara, or you see yourself as part of this incredible vine image and being interconnected and related to everyone. And then I'll just finish with this image of the tree of life, which was at Holden Village this wonderful triptych. The problem with artists, when you try to draw the tree of life too literally, how are you going to do a tree that's on both sides of the river? Because that's how it is in Revelation, but it's one single tree. So this is how artist Christian Gillia painted it a few years ago. And I think she was at Valparaiso 2 years ago for the Liturgical Institute when I spoke also, and was working on some of these same kinds of images. I did put a movie at the end, but I'm not going to show it. This regenerative gardening, climate Victory Gardens video that I just love. But I think we can all be part of the tree of life by planting a garden, by healing our soil, healing our world through individual little acts. And that, just to say at the end here, that's what Tikkun Olam is about. In that Science Tikkun article, that was great as well. But Rabbi Sachs emphasizes, let me just close with a quote from him about Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is a vision of cosmic catastrophe progressively healed by individual deeds, which, though they may seem small and local, can mend the world. It was Rabbi Luria, this mystic in the Jewish medieval mysticism thought, that came up with this. He says it's grounded in Mishnaic teachings, but it's this idea that, here it is, the significance of Lurianic Kabbalah. So that's the kind of mysticism Luria did, is that it is redemption of small steps, act by act, day by day. Each act mends a fractured world. The way from here to there, like the journey of the Israelites, takes time. There are setbacks along the way, but each act, step by step, day by day, mends another fracture in the world. Okay, I'll stop there. I know I've covered a lot of stuff, and I really want to hear what kinds of questions or responses you all have. So I think I'm going to quit screen sharing if I can figure out how to do it. There, stop share. Now, how do I get to stop share? There. Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been just amazing. I think we've got conversations for a long time. So thank you. Now my students actually have an assignment for each of our speakers to come up with a question or a keynote.
Oh, good.
So many of them may have those questions just bouncing up and down in the background, ready to ask. So I will just leave it to you and them to, I think you can see their faces enough to call.
Yeah, just jump in, because I'm not very good at that blue hand and stuff. So just feel free to just call out questions. Or responses. I mean, I want to know where you've seen the tree of life in your life, or where you see yourself in the tree of life today, and how it fits for healing.
Can I ask my question real quick? I don't know if you can see me.
Is that Victoria?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I was just wondering, you mentioned like resisting cravings as a way to like help heal the earth, and then that last part about how like each act, like even as the individual, each act help mends the world. How do you think people can be motivated to help? Because I think when it's not their convenience, or when they can't see the effects directly, people don't have the motivation to, and people are happy to help when it's going out and doing something, but when it's actually changing a behavior, I think people could be a lot more resistant.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because just to say, in some ways, the situation is so urgent now that it's not just individual acts we need, it's political action. So we need to organize for like things like a price on carbon. That's probably the most important right now, is because, when there's no price to pollute, then people are going to do it for free. So we need to have market pricing that actually reflects the reality. So certainly individual deeds are really important. I mean, I've got those solar panels on my house. Okay, but I mean, what's 38 solar panels going to do? But it's like a sign. So individual acts, yes. But if somebody doesn't recycle, it probably doesn't really matter. What's more important is that they vote and organize to get a movement going. And that, I think that's really a great biblical idea too. So I realized I just read the comment about individual acts. They all add up. So I'm part of an organizing effort right now. And one person said, you know, what difference is 200 more people going to make on this? And I'm like, well, because it's inch by inch, you know, 200 people here, 200 people there, and pretty soon we've changed the world. We've grown a movement. And I think that's how every great movement went, civil rights or whatever. So our individual, I guess what I want to say is I really, Victoria, I agree with you that individual acts are so important, but don't let anyone's individual hypocrisy stop what needs to happen. You know, I mean, I ate a dopey plastic meal, you know, the other day, and I don't know, I bought it in the store. It appealed to me. I ate some Pringles last night, you know, stuff like that. So trying to eat lower on the food chain, trying to eat more plant-based, trying to, you know, participate in recycling everything is really important. But the most important is to get a movement going. I see Joe's hand up.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was a great talk. But then I also wanted to ask, why do you think that like earth healing and environmental issues are not as high on a lot of religious leaders' agendas, if you'll use that word? Like why don't religious people care a lot more?
Oh, that's a really good question. I try to show that it's high on religious leaders' agenda. That's not the problem. I mean, you've got the head of the Catholic Church and the head of the Greek Orthodox Church. Bishop Eaton is going to preach a sermon for the Lutherans. Lutherans Restoring Creation is doing a worship service on the Sunday closest to Earth Day in April. I think it's April 25th. So it's not the leaders that are the problem so much as it is the deception and the lies that lobbyists have deliberately sold to people. I think it's so here, I mean, I'm willing to sound like a kind of radical here, but I use the work of a Harvard historian of science, Merchants of Doubt. What is her name? I've got it right over here. Here it is. Naomi Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt. She points out that the very same people who are into marketing climate denial are the same ones who marketed tobacco and said that tobacco didn't cause cancer. So we have been deliberately deceived by corporations, but I think religious communities really are getting involved. So hopefully yours will as well. But the problem is, well, what is the problem? What do you think, Joe?
I'm not sure. I mean, I've always been a pretty environmental person, and I definitely have really liked reading your essay because, you know, it's interesting that, you know, if God created the world, then, you know, why are we mistreating one of his creations? You know, it's not just the people that matter, it's all the world. So I don't think I have a great answer either. I guess I would agree with you. You know, probably some corporations, but yeah, it's very fascinating.
And, you know, this whole idea of tipping points, we never know when we'll get enough to tip things really fast towards renewable energy because the price points are there. Renewable energy is the cheapest thing. Well, you have tons of wind turbines in Indiana. I mean, it's by far the cheapest. So if we electrify everything, if we start to produce energy, it's just that foot dragging comes from those who are wedded to making money in fossil fuels. But if you in your public health work can help people see that the number of asthma deaths will be reduced so much, I mean that the actual health outcomes of ceasing to burn fossil fuel and in coal, the mercury that's in it, I mean, this will really save lives, hundreds of millions of lives. We know that. And so you all can be really leading the change from a health perspective, I think. You know, people are always trying to pit jobs versus the environment. That's not a good, not a good framing because renewable energy is going to produce more jobs than anything else. So it's just a combination of fear, disinformation. Well, like anything with health, why are there so many people opposed to vaccines? You know, all kinds of stuff like that. You have to counter false messaging and get a different narrative out there. And, you know, I have high hopes for you, very high hopes. Dakota, I'm not good at seeing your hands. Then Taylor, I couldn't tell if you had your hand up after that or if you're just, okay, Dakota.
Sorry, I didn't want to like cut anyone off, but I really liked what you said about the Bible being a liberating voice that kind of shows people how to critique people in power as they did with like the Romans. I really liked that idea. How would you suggest that we apply that today in when it comes to social justice and climate justice? How is the best way to use the Bible to critique the ones in power and push them to make better policies and just do better?
Oh, I love your questions. This is so great. Well, what I have learned is that sometimes the most effective is to tell Bible stories, like tell the story of Pharaoh and Moses and liberation Exodus. I mean, I don't know if you watched on TV the other night the special about the Black church led by Lewis at Harvard. What is it? But you know, that's what the Black church has done so beautifully through singing spirituals and everything, is to give people hope and subversive hope, kind of by telling these stories of Exodus and liberation, other Bible stories. Oh, in my class this fall, one of the students that really spoke to the students, or one of the stories, was Naboth's vineyard. This evil king tries to steal a vineyard, and the prophet tells him, no, you can't do that. And I guess, you know, it's wonderful to realize how many stories are in the Bible of economic injustice being critiqued. And so if you just tell stories like you guys learned to do last week with that story of the pump and the cholera in London, stories, I use the work of this guy, one of my sort of saints and heroes, Daniel Erlander. I don't know if you know his work at all. He writes a lot, but he draws cartoons of Bible stories and beautiful, disarming cartoons, yet they're very, very radical. He's got the Egypt system and the Roman Empire, but he says that he thinks everybody has a kind of trapdoor in the back of their head that stories can get into and sneak up on you and disarm you. And sort of like there's a wonderful parable where the prophet has to confront King David because he's stolen Uriah's wife and then had Uriah killed. And the prophet tells a story about a little lamb, and King David gets all upset and says, you know, whoever's done this should be killed. And then the prophet says, you are the man, you're the one. So stories have this amazing subversive power to get people. Like in one of the Occupy Wall Street, I don't know if you remember that from, what was that, 4 or 5 years ago. I thought it was just great. Some of the demonstrators carried a float of the golden calf in the Exodus story, you know, where people were worshiping money, basically worshiping the golden calf made out of gold. And the Occupy Wall Street protesters were saying, this is what's going on Wall Street. But they used a biblical image, a biblical symbol to prophetically call out the, you know, the hedge funds. So I think you can use stories rather than just, you know, prophetic judgment, but you can tell amazing stories about empires getting confronted in some really amazing, even humorous and powerful ways.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please. Is
Thank
it
you.
Noelle?
Yes.
Wow, see, I'm getting better at this Zoom stuff. Okay, great.
Yes. I think you mentioned in your article the dotes corporis, the qualities of bodies after resurrection. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, or maybe about which of the properties of resurrected bodies might be your favorite.
You know, well, first of all, I have to say we don't know much about for sure what resurrection is like, because this is all kind of imagined futures. That's why I put in there eschatology is all about sort of imagining, and we do that by using the Bible and using scripture and tradition and doctrines to help us. But yeah, it's just I don't know, I can't say. I mean, I think the whole idea of resurrection, it started, we can say, in the time of a very oppressive regime. So you see it in the biblical book of Maccabees, for example, I guess apocryphal, but it's biblical for Catholics, where when victims of torture and violence are resurrected to bear witness. So resurrection starts as this notion of your deeds are not in vain. Your life is not in vain. It continues even after you've been killed. But as to what resurrection looks like, I mean, I think it's kind of amazing that the disciples don't recognize the risen Jesus, so we're going to look different, but what it is, and I don't know, what are your favorite aspects of resurrection?
I know she said her internet was being unstable.
Okay, and I can't remember what I said about it in this article, so my apologies here. But it's the idea that we have a future in the heart of God, and nobody is left behind. I think, the immortality of the soul is not the central focus in Christian doctrine at all. It's something different. And so you get stories in the Bible like Ezekiel and the dry bones, where he breathes into the bones and then they resurrect. You get in John chapter 11, you get the raising of Lazarus. And you've got other stories already back in the prophets, Elijah and Elisha both do. But what resurrection looks like, I think Paul even, in his letter to the Corinthians, he talks about it like a seed. And, I think the biblical authors struggle to say what it's like because we really don't know, but we know it's something good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. I haven't looked at the chat box. Somebody will have to read me some things if there's stuff there, but I know last week you did great chat. Oh, somebody said you studied the column of Trajan in art history?
Yes, I did. It was a really cool piece to go over. From what I remember, it took them like a crazy amount of time. They did it very quickly, given how detailed it is, and it's in stone, and it took a lot of laborers to like help. So it was really cool to see that crossover.
And that it's all about war. I mean, that's what you realize is we've got to change the narrative. So it's not about war, but yeah, it is a stunningly beautiful column and very, I would say, eschatological because of that spiraling up.
Yeah, I think like just seeing the work and time that they put into a piece of work that revolves solely around war and violence kind of like says something in and of itself, really.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a project in Chicago, I think it's called Healing Violence, working with gangs and many, many people that we've got to heal our violence of our culture that goes so far back in time. It's just,
We're actually running, our time is coming to an end here, unfortunately. But there are so many, I know that there's so many questions that, I would be very happy to forward on to Professor Rossing everyone's questions especially those that haven't been able to be asked. We don't want to, you don't have any obligation to respond to them at all because we don't want to infringe on your time. You've given us so much time here. But I think this is just stimulating. So thank you so much.
oh, thank you. It's been great. So is it Thursday that you're discussing Steve DeGrucci's article?
Yes.
Oh, I'd love to listen in on that if you give me permission, then maybe if you want me. So Joe has got a nice yellow hand here. I got to learn how to do that stuff. Where do you get those things?
It's down at the bottom with reactions.
There I see. Okay, reactions, great. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been great to meet with all of you. And I've loved, hearing the health discussion that you've been doing. So thank you so much for this wonderful class.
Well, thank you. And just everyone, I invite you to thank Professor Rossing for her time with us and for all that we've learned today. And I'll stay online for as long as necessary, but I recognize people we'll have to leave. If you want to stay after and ask more questions, feel free to do that as well.
I can stay on for a couple more minutes if you want, but you probably don't need me, or do you?
It's up to you.
I can stay on till 4:30. I guess that's not very long.
All right, it looks like people are
Oh, just very nice comments. Thank you.